But Martin Luther quite explicitly called the Pope the Antichrist, that the Pope sits with his mouth under the anus of Satan, and Satan poops into his mouth and he eats it, and they slobber it up like pigs. And I mean, man, it gets disgusting. Yes, so Protestant scholars were deliberately searching for a way to bypass 1500 years of the historical record. Yes, that's exactly what they did. Can you be anti-Zionist without being seen as anti-Semitic in today's environment? Can you be stupid while saying stupid things? Yes, you can. Because just as the whole idea of Israel, the Jews, Palestine, you've been lied to about that, you've also been lied to about what Zionism is. You've been lied to about that too. So can I accept one lie while giving some ground on another lie? Of course you can. If you want to be a liar or half liar, 50% liar, which, yeah, sure, go ahead. You can do that, Philip. That is possible. So let's continue. It is quite difficult to get a complete understanding of Martin Luther's childhood because the information is limited. He was abused as a child. He was emotionally and physically abused as a child. He was beaten by his teacher. His mother was abusive towards him. His father was abusive. There are rumors. Now, I haven't touched on this, and I will not be touching on this really in my Luther talks because I don't find enough solid evidence beyond sort of speculation. But it's rumored that he murdered somebody. His father almost certainly murdered somebody. His father was almost certainly a murderer. They left where they lived because his father was wanted for murder or would be wanted, so they abandoned where they were. They ran away. And the man was after money and wealth and privilege and power and so on. Many biographies focus on his adult life, emphasizing his work as a monk and instigating what would become the Protestant Reformation. Eric Erickson, author of Young Man Luther, explains the literature on Luther and by Luther is stupendous in volume. Yet it adds up to very few reliable data on his childhood and youth, his role in history, and above all, his personality remains ambiguous on a grandiose scale. What's interesting, you'll find that there's the most well-known man in history is Martin Luther. More's been written about his life. Yeah, sure. We know nothing about his early life, really. That's just been scrubbed out or thrown on the carpet or whatever. Okay. Okay, that's a very good point. Daniel Rodriguez, you can sway 1,000 men by appealing to their prejudices quicker than you can convince one man by logic. Yes, very true. So let me continue. Okay, so despite the detailed understanding of Luther's childhood, many scholars have studied his early life and are able to shed light on the nebulous early years of Martin Luther and how he became the foremost leader of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Of course, as I said, lately I've been discovering he had nothing to do with the Reformation. Of course, Dino Dennis, Zionism was the movement to want a Jewish state. Unless you're saying that Jews should all go live in Brooklyn or something, and there were no Jews and they never had a land, they never had a state, they shouldn't own land, they should be dispossessed, they should be kicked out of the country, and you should give it to the Arabs, right? That's the option. That's the option. Martin Luther is born November 10th. That date is important, and we'll see why, because an event called the Night of the Long Knives occurs as well, where the Nazis decide to kill their political enemies. And of course, that was, in one sense, their celebration of Martin Luther's birthday, in honor of Martin Luther. They decided to murder all of their political enemies. So his family was described as rugged, rough at times, coarse, very coarse, credulous and devout. Now, of course, there are many, many stories of Luther being poor and his family. None of it's true. There are many, many stories designed to paint him in a sympathetic light, where his biographers and historians have lied about Martin Luther's circumstances to make him as sympathetic as possible. Luther was raised in an extremely strict environment, receiving whippings at home and school. Luther was quoted in 1532 saying, "One shouldn't whip children too hard. My father once whipped me so severely that I ran away, and he was worried that he might not win me back. I wouldn't like to strike my little Hans very much, lest he should become shy and hate me." Disturbing details of Luther's childhood punishments describe a child flogged until he bled. So he was whipped until he bled. Whipped as often as 15 times a day for ridiculous offenses. So this led him to isolate himself from his parents and even perhaps led him to choose the life of a monk. It has been argued that the severity of his upbringing caused Luther to have a neurotic temperament, and that as a child he was wild and mistrustful. In other words, he would be paranoid. He had a paranoid personality and he had wild mood swings. He was like a manic depressive. He suffered from an uneasiness of spirit combined with melancholia, right? Now, melancholia is a mood disorder characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and a lack of interest in activities that person normally enjoys. So it is a more severe form of depression, right? So the man had feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of self-harm, feelings of suicide, feelings of self-hatred, massive feelings of depression, and then you have euphoria. And so that was Martin Luther. These sufferings would impact Luther's later life. He was a very sickly man, just like Charles Darwin. And he suffered from scrupulosity as well. He suffered from extreme mood swings. All have been attributed to his childhood upbringing. These abrupt fluctuations in behavior have been described as extraordinarily sensitive and subject to recurrent periods of euphoria and depression. So he was not mentally well balanced. Hey there, Islamic Origins. Awesome show. I watched as much as I could. Then I came over, but really fantastic information. You are tearing the sin apart. Well done. So thank you. Yeah, so as a young man, Luther studied to become a lawyer. Now, remember, John Calvin was a lawyer. Now, we all learn that, well, Martin, he was bipolar. Yes, Artsy Fartsy. Martin Luther was, for all intents and purposes, bipolar. I lived with a bipolar person once. It is madness. It was weird. It was the craziest thing. So, yes, he was bipolar. So, now, we are told Martin Luther was a great theologian. What few people know is, at least I have not been able to find hard evidence on this, but what I've heard from discussions is that back in the day, there was no, shall we say, by default, you studied law. Law was something that you effectively studied by default. So you basically, at the universities, you came out as a lawyer, right? So you were given a law degree because they didn't have a proper theology or philosophy degree. So Martin Luther was a lawyer. So he learned how to do lawyering and speak in those legal terms and twist words and make legal arguments, just like John Calvin did. John Calvin was a lawyer. Martin Luther was a lawyer. So having already received his bachelor's and master's degrees in the field of law, he suddenly abandoned this career path to become a monk. So the story goes, there was a severe thunderstorm and he blah, blah. We all heard the story. I'm not interested. That story is probably false.